What if one of the strangest horror movies of the last decade was not inspired by an ancient legend, a cursed house, or a demonic case file, but by a real experiment in which researchers tried to create a ghost, not summon one, create one? That is the unnerving idea behind The Quiet Ones, a horror film marketed as being inspired by true events. But the real story behind it is even more disturbing than the movie itself, because at the center of this mystery is a genuine parapsychology case from the 1970s known as the Philip experiment. A group of intelligent adults sat together, invented a completely fictional dead man, gave him a face, a backstory, a tragic life, and then, over time, began to receive responses from him. Tables moved, knocks answered questions. The room seemed to react. And the most terrifying part is this: if the experiment worked, then either they created a spirit with their minds, or they proved how easily the human mind can manufacture the feeling of the supernatural. Welcome to the 9th reel, and today we are diving into the horror movie based on a real experiment, and why the real experiment may be scarier than the film. To understand this story, we need to separate two layers: the movie and the real case that inspired it. The movie is The Quiet Ones, released by Hammer Films, the legendary British studio once famous for gothic horror. On the surface, it looks like a familiar possession story. A professor, a troubled young woman, a team of students, strange noises, unexplained violence, and a supernatural force that seems to grow stronger the more it is studied. But unlike most horror films, this one was not built around a haunted house myth or a church archive. Its core premise comes from a real idea in psychical research: the possibility that human beings can unconsciously generate paranormal phenomena through belief, focus, trauma, and group expectation. That is where the Philip experiment enters the picture. In the early 1970s, members of the Toronto Society for Psychical Research in Canada set out to test a bizarre question: if seances and hauntings were sometimes real, were spirits always pre-existing entities? Or could a group of people, through concentration and expectation, actually produce the effects themselves? To test this, they did something that sounds almost absurd at first. They made up a ghost. They invented a fictional character named Philip Aylesford. He was designed to feel historically plausible. According to the story the group created, Philip was an English aristocrat living in the mid-17th century. They gave him a detailed biography. He had a wife, Dorothea, whom he did not love. He fell in love with a young Romani woman named Margot. In some versions of the story, Margot was accused of witchcraft and executed. Philip, broken by grief and guilt, later killed himself. It was melodramatic, tragic, and perfect for the emotional atmosphere of a haunting. But Philip was not real. That is the key point. He was not a forgotten historical figure. He was not a documented dead man. He was a shared invention. The group then began a long process of collective focus. They met repeatedly, talked about Philip, visualized his personality, imagined his face, and discussed the details of his life as if he had once existed. In the beginning, nothing happened. For months, there was no ghostly breakthrough, no voice, no movement, no spirit materialization. If the story had ended there, it would have been forgotten as a fringe curiosity. But then the researchers changed their method. Instead of treating the sessions like a dry laboratory exercise, they shifted into something much closer to a traditional seance. They dimmed the lights, they sat around a table, they loosened the mood, they sang songs, they joked. They created an atmosphere charged with expectation, rhythm, and emotional participation. And that was when things reportedly started. The table began to move, not dramatically floating across the room like in movies, but tilting, shifting, and responding in ways the group found meaningful. There were knocks and raps. Questions were asked, and the sounds seemed to answer. In some sessions, the responses appeared structured enough that participants believed they were communicating with Philip himself. This is where the case becomes deeply unsettling, because if the reports are taken at face value, The group seemed to establish contact with an entity they themselves had invented. A ghost that should not have existed began behaving as if it did exist. Now, there are two radically different ways to interpret that. The paranormal interpretation is the most sensational one. Maybe intense collective focus somehow created a thought form, what some traditions would call a tulpa, an egregore, or a psychic construct. In this reading, Philip was not a dead man contacted from the afterlife. He was something born from shared mental energy, a presence created by belief and then externalized into the physical world. That idea is terrifying enough on its own. It suggests human consciousness may be capable of generating experiences that feel autonomous, even intelligent. But the skeptical interpretation may be even more disturbing because it requires no ghost at all. Skeptics point to something called the ideomotor effect, the same principle often used to explain Ouija boards and pendulums. People can produce small physical movements unconsciously, without realizing they are doing it. When a group is emotionally engaged, highly suggestible, and primed to expect a result, those unconscious movements can become coordinated enough to create convincing effects. The table moves, but no one feels personally responsible. The knock seems external, but it may emerge from the group's own subtle actions. In that explanation, Philip was never a spirit. He was a social and psychological event. And that is where the real horror begins. Because if the group unconsciously created the evidence, then the experiment becomes a case study in how easily human beings can co-author a haunting without meaning to. It becomes a warning about memory, suggestion, expectation, and the dangerous power of shared belief. It suggests that people do not always fake supernatural experiences. Sometimes they may genuinely experience something mysterious that they themselves are helping to produce. That possibility is what gives this story lasting power. A lot of popular retellings oversimplify the Philip experiment and make it sound like scientists proved ghosts were real. That is not what happened. The original researchers themselves did not present it in such a simplistic way. One of the most interesting features of the experiment is that it sits directly on the border between psychical research and psychology. It does not neatly confirm either side. Believers see it as evidence that consciousness can affect reality in extraordinary ways. Skeptics see it as evidence that human beings are astonishingly good at generating meaning out of ambiguity. Either way, something important happened, and that ambiguity is exactly what makes it perfect raw material for horror cinema. When the Quiet Ones adapted this basic idea, it did not retell the Philip experiment literally. Instead, it transformed it. The film takes the core concept that a group can generate or intensify a supernatural force through mental and emotional processes and pushes it into far darker territory. In the movie, the story centers on a professor and his students who try to prove that paranormal manifestations are not the work of demons, but the product of human negative energy. Their subject is a disturbed young woman named Jane Harper. The team believes they can isolate, study, and perhaps even manufacture the entity attached to her. That is where the film becomes pure horror. Because unlike the real Philip experiment, which was relatively controlled and largely non-violent, The Quiet Ones asks a much more cinematic and dangerous question. What if the thing generated by the mind did not stay symbolic? What if emotional damage, repression, and obsession could create something with teeth? The film adds possession imagery, physical threat, religious undertones, and the visual language of found footage realism. It takes an already eerie real-world concept and gives it a body, a face, and an escalating appetite. In doing so, it changes the meaning of the original case. The real experiment was about whether minds could create paranormal-like effects. The movie turns that into a nightmare about whether human beings can bring monsters into the world by trying too hard to explain them. And here is a premium insight most casual viewers miss. The real Philip experiment is arguably more philosophically frightening than the movie, because the experiment attacks a basic comfort people have about horror. Most supernatural horror lets us believe the danger comes from outside. a demon, a ghost, a cursed object, a dead child in a hallway. Something alien enters the human world and disrupts it. But the Philip experiment flips that structure. It suggests the danger may come from inside the group itself, not from a spirit entering the room, but from people, together, creating the conditions that make the spirit appear real. That is a much more modern fear, and in many ways, a much more relevant one. Because once you understand the Philip experiment as a story about collective expectation, it stops being just about ghosts. It becomes a story about how reality is shaped in groups. It becomes a story about social contagion, about suggestibility, about performance turning into belief, about a narrative becoming powerful enough that people begin living inside it. And that idea extends far beyond paranormal research. Think about the internet. Think about online panic cycles. Think about conspiracy communities. Think about how fast a rumor can become a certainty once enough people emotionally invest in it. Think about how a group can build a fictional figure, a hidden enemy, a secret plan, a haunted narrative, and then begin finding evidence everywhere. The Philip experiment feels like a seance-era prototype for the modern information age. A group creates a character. The character gains emotional weight. The group looks for responses. Ambiguous events get interpreted as proof. Soon, the creation starts to feel independent of its creators. That is not just paranormal logic. That is social media logic. That is mass psychology. And suddenly this little Canadian experiment from the 1970s feels less like a fringe oddity and more like a blueprint for how human beings generate conviction. There is another hidden detail that makes the case even more fascinating. The Philip experiment did not remain completely isolated. Follow-up attempts with other invented personalities, including figures such as Lilith and Sebastian, were later reported by researchers exploring similar methods. The exact details vary depending on the source, and not all accounts are equally rigorous. But the broader claim was that Philip may not have been a one-time fluke. In other words, if the phenomenon was real in any form, paranormal or psychological, it might be reproducible. That possibility changes everything. A one-off haunting can be dismissed as myth. A repeatable haunting becomes a mechanism, and mechanisms are what horror is made of. This is also why the case continues to fascinate documentary makers, paranormal enthusiasts, skeptics, and horror fans alike. Believers are drawn to the possibility that human thought can manifest entities. Skeptics are drawn to how beautifully the case illustrates unconscious movement, suggestion, and group reinforcement. Filmmakers are drawn to the dramatic middle zone, where nobody can fully prove what happened, but everybody agrees it was weird. That uncertainty is the engine, and it is the same engine that powers the most effective horror movies. The best horror does not simply ask, "Is the monster real?" It asks, "What if reality itself is less stable than we thought?" The Philip experiment does exactly that. It destabilizes the border between imagination and event, between fiction and experience, between the story we tell and the thing that starts happening in the room. That is why The Quiet Ones works as a concept even for viewers who do not love the movie itself. The premise is almost impossible not to find compelling. A team tries to study the supernatural scientifically. Instead of debunking it, they may be manufacturing it. Instead of discovering what is out there, they discover what people are capable of bringing forth together. The film, of course, exaggerates. It condenses. It dramatizes. It turns uncertainty into terror. That is what movies do. But underneath the cinematic shocks lies one of the strangest ideas ever pulled from real-world paranormal research. And here is the final twist. The real Philip experiment may be scary for the exact opposite reason people first assume. It is not scary because it proves ghosts exist. It is scary because it may prove that human beings do not need ghosts in order to create hauntings. If the paranormal reading is true, then consciousness is far stranger and more dangerous than mainstream science usually allows. If the skeptical reading is true, then human perception is far less reliable than we want to believe. Either way, the floor drops out beneath us. Either the mind can reach outward and make something, or the mind can fool itself so completely that a fiction begins to behave like fact. That is the nightmare at the center of this story. And that is why the real experiment behind the quiet ones still matters. Because long after the credits roll, the most unsettling question remains. When people gather in darkness and expect something to answer, what exactly are they hearing back? A ghost? A force? A trick of the muscles? A trick of the mind? Or the sound of a story becoming real because enough people needed it to be? That is what makes this more than just a horror movie footnote. It is not just a creepy piece of trivia. It is a window into one of the oldest and most uncomfortable fears humans have ever faced, that the mind is not merely a witness to horror. It may be one of its authors. This is the ninth reel. If you want more deep research on the real history behind disturbing films, subscribe and stay with us. And tell me in the comments, what is more frightening to you? A real ghost, or the possibility that a group of ordinary people can create one?